When I worked part-time as a waitress, I saw my boyfriend at someone's birthday banquet. That was when I found out he was actually from a wealthy family. He had always been critical of me, insisting that roses were useless and impractical, yet on that night, he ordered 999 roses to celebrate another girl's birthday. It also happened to be my birthday. I quietly watched it all unfold and chose to walk away. Later, I blocked all his contact information and left the city. That was when he lost his mind. I met Kerwin during a part-time job in college. We worked at a cafe near campus. The first time I saw him, he was wearing a crisp white shirt with deep striking features. He looked just like the campus prince from a novel, the kind of guy who worked hard to support himself through school. As we got to know each other, we exchanged phone numbers, studied together in the library, and even took part-time jobs together. Thanks to Kerwin's stunning looks, everyone in college knew there was a handsome guy working at the cafe. People lined up to ask for his number. At first, he politely declined, but when it became too much, he casually pushed me forward and said, "She's my girlfriend." I was caught off guard and was about to deny it, but the sincerity in Kerwin's eyes made me stop. Against my better judgment, I didn't refute him and went along with it. Eventually, he confessed his feelings, and what started as a pretend relationship turned into the real thing. After graduation, we rented an apartment and moved in together. He was an orphan, and I came from an impoverished family, so we both valued money deeply. Living expenses in the city were high, and as fresh graduates, we were worth less than the clothes on our backs. On weekends, we'd take up part-time jobs to save for our future wedding fund. So when I landed a temporary waitressing gig that paid $200 an hour, I was overjoyed. But when I saw Kerwin, who was supposed to be working overtime at that banquet, the smile on my face froze. The always frugal Kerwin had traded his usual plain style for a tailored black suit with his bangs swept back to reveal his forehead. He stood tall and calm, his proud expression giving off an untouchable aura. If it weren't for that familiar face, I might not have recognized him. He was surrounded by wealthy elites, each eager to win his favor, while he regarded them with cold indifference, like a god watching mortals grovel. I stood there in shock until Kara, my coworker for the night, gave me a nudge and asked, concerned, "Are you okay?" I shook my head, my gaze fixed on Kerwin, who seemed a world away. My voice was hesitant as I asked, "Who is he?" Kara glanced at him and lowered her voice. "I heard he's the heir to the richest family in this city." I stared at Kerwin, now a stranger to me. The boyfriend I'd spent 4 years with, the man who had no parents and seemed so pitiable, had turned out to be the heir to a wealthy family. Instinctively, I pulled out my phone and sent him a message. Kerwin, who had been lounging lazily with a crowd gathered around him, glanced at his phone when it buzzed. Someone nearby teased him, "Who is it?" He gave his phone a cursory glance and replied indifferently, "No one important. Just spam." Hearing this, I felt as if I'd fallen into an icy abyss. My entire body trembled. To Kerwin, I was nothing more than someone insignificant. It all made sense. In our 4 years together, I hadn't even known his true identity. I suddenly felt pathetic, as if all my efforts had been in vain. The banquet was bustling with life, but none of it belonged to me. I stood there silently watching the scene unfold. A woman in an elegant evening gown sat beside Kerwin, her proud expression paired with flawless makeup, making her look like a princess straight out of a fairy tale. Kara pushed a massive 5-tiered cake to the center of the room, its sweet scent of cream and fruit filling the air. Even from a distance, guests began presenting their gifts to the woman with Kerwin, making the grand finale. He gestured for someone to bring in 999 roses. The woman was so moved that she covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up in her eyes. The crowd cheered, and I stood among a few others in mascot costumes, awkwardly holding the roses. My eyes stung, but no tears came. I couldn't even describe what I felt at that moment. Through the costume, I watched Kerwin as if I were seeing him for the first time. I thought back to our first Valentine's Day. We had gone out shopping, and I begged him to buy me roses when I saw them on the street. He refused. Once Kerwin made up his mind, no amount of coaxing or pleading could change it. What did he say back then? Roses don't symbolize love. They're just a marketing gimmick to brainwash women. Roses aren't romantic, they're a waste of money, a tax on stupidity. I had been upset at the time. Even though he wasn't entirely wrong, I still wanted a bouquet of roses from my boyfriend. When I was sulking, Kerwin plucked a piece of wild grass from the park and twisted it into a simple ring for me. I had been so moved, I cried and even felt guilty for my childishness. Now, looking at the scene before me, I only felt ridiculous. He never thought buying roses was a waste of money, perhaps buying them for me was the real waste. The banquet was lively, but it had nothing to do with me. I quietly finished my work, collected my paycheck, and left. By the time I got back to our rental apartment, it was nearly midnight. Kerwin wasn't home. Exhausted, I collapsed on the couch. It was my birthday. I had planned to use the money from this gig to buy myself a cake and a small gift, but on the way home, I felt completely dazed and went straight back without stopping anywhere. Looking around at the familiar furnishings and decorations, I thought about how we had built this home together over the years. We had even promised to save up and eventually buy this place. That promise had kept me working hard, even on my birthday. When I saw the $200 an hour job, I couldn't pass it up. After all, what else could I do? If I hadn't gone, I wouldn't have learned the truth, but would that have allowed me to keep deceiving myself? I hugged my knees on the couch, unsure how much time had passed before I heard the door open. Kerwin was back. He had swapped his luxurious suit for his usual white shirt, once again looking like the ordinary man I thought I knew. I stared at him, saying nothing. Kerwin changed out of his clothes and walked over to hug me. I pushed him away, looking at the exhaustion on his face, and asked, "Why didn't you reply to my message?" Kerwin's expression stiffened momentarily before returning to normal. "Sorry, I didn't see it." "You have no idea how much overtime I've had today," he said with a hint of grievance on his face. If I hadn't seen him at that party earlier, basking in everyone's attention, I might have believed his act. "Do you even remember?" I asked, my voice dry and hoarse as I spoke slowly. "Today is my birthday." I had thought his excuse about working overtime was true, and maybe he'd surprise me afterward. We've been together for 4 years, and for the first 3, he always celebrated my birthday with me. But now, it's clear he simply forgot, or maybe he's just grown tired of me. He forgot his official girlfriend's birthday but went out of his way to celebrate someone else's with 999 roses he's never given me. My nose stung as tears threatened to spill, but I held them back. Kerwin had clearly forgotten. He frowned, apologized, and promised to make it up to me tomorrow with a gift. I didn't respond. He thought I was upset about not getting a present, so he half-heartedly comforted me before falling asleep. I didn't throw a fit or say anything. I just watched his sleeping face. The face I had memorized countless times suddenly felt unfamiliar. We've had arguments before, even broken up temporarily, but it was always just out of frustration. This time was different. "Kerwin, this time I'm really done with you." I submitted my resignation letter at work. I didn't tell Kerwin and booked a train ticket to City Z. As I left, I took one last look at the city. This was the city where my dreams with Kerwin began. Back then, I was young and naive, believing I could spend my whole life with him and imagining we'd build a home in this big city. But in the end, it was just my dream, one I had all by myself. Now, I'm awake. I dragged my suitcase and boarded the train. On the train, I looked at Kerwin's contact photo and, against my better judgment, sent him a message. Then, I blocked him on every platform. This game of pretending to be poor ends here. Reality isn't a movie. No one spirals into a 2 or 3 year depression over a failed relationship, not even me. Time moves forward. I gathered myself, updated my resume, and started job hunting. Since I wasn't a recent graduate, my bachelor's degree didn't give me much of a competitive edge. Day after day, I threw myself into a relentless cycle of sending resumes and attending interviews. Thankfully, I had saved up a decent amount of money during my years with Kerwin, hoping we'd use it to build a home together. Even though I was unemployed for a while, I wasn't struggling financially. My busy schedule left me little time to dwell on him. Before long, I landed a job and finally settled down. My life became routine, commuting between my office and my rental apartment, living quietly on my own. I thought this world was big enough that after leaving the city, I'd never cross paths with Kerwin again. But fate, or perhaps irony, had other plans. During an interview at my new company, I saw him again. Kerwin was sitting in the manager's office chair. In just a few months, he had returned to his true identity, a tailored suit fitting him perfectly, looking every bit the man I had seen that night at the party. Of course, he was never some poor boy to begin with. I handed him the document, pretending not to recognize him, and maintained a professional demeanor. Just as I was about to leave his office, I felt someone grab my wrist. I looked down at the hand holding me and followed it up to Kerwin's face. His expression was blank, but he held on tightly, pulling me closer. I tried to break free, but the strength difference between us made resistance pointless. The office was empty. Standing before me, Kerwin's face showed no emotion, but I could tell he was angry. "Why?" he asked, his eyes filled with frustration as they locked onto mine. I stayed silent, simply staring at him. My expression was a mix of resignation and indifference. Kerwin looked down at me like I was a cat throwing a tantrum. "Stop it, okay?" I was wrong. "Stop it," he said with those two words, dismissing everything and making it seem like I was the one being unreasonable. I laughed bitterly. "Who dares to blame you?" Hearing this, his hand, which had been reaching toward me, froze. Then he placed it on my head as if trying to soothe me. His voice was calm. "Is it really just because of this? Don't be mad anymore, okay? Let's go eat." He brushed the matter aside like it was nothing, no explanation, no apology. "What about the roses?" I insisted, staring at him, hoping for an honest answer. His expression remained calm. "She's just a childhood friend," he said. "You ditched me on my birthday, celebrated hers, and gave her 999 roses, and you call that just a friend?" "It's not what you think," Kerwin replied, his tone steady and detached, as if this was none of his concern. Hearing this, my chest tightened, and tears welled up. "Do you even remember? In all our years together, you've never given me roses for my birthday or Valentine's Day." For years, I let his words convince me I didn't like roses, but really, who doesn't want their partner to give them flowers on special occasions? "You like roses? I'll have them delivered right now," Kerwin said earnestly. I looked at him, this man who still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. "Maybe I was wrong from the start," I said, shaking off his hand and walking toward the door. As I reached for the handle, his voice came from behind. "My patience has its limits. I've already explained myself. What more do you want?" I opened the door. "If you walk out of this room, I will try to stop you again," Kerwin warned, using our relationship as leverage. "This is the end for us," I said, stepping through the doorway without hesitation. Looking back, I wondered why I hadn't seen it sooner. Kerwin had made it clear many times he didn't love me. Every time we argued, I was always the first to back down. Maybe my willingness to compromise made him feel invincible. This was the first time Kerwin had lowered himself to apologize to me. He probably didn't believe I'd leave him for good, but he was wrong. At work, I buried myself in tasks, but trouble found me anyway. My once friendly colleagues began targeting me. Projects were repeatedly rejected and sent back for revisions. I was often singled out to stay late after hours. Conversations among colleagues would stop abruptly when I walked into the room. I knew this was all Kerwin's doing. After 4 years together, I understood him better than anyone. He seemed indifferent on the surface, but he held grudges. What he once directed at others, he now turned on me. That night, like clockwork, I was left alone in the office to work overtime. The empty room echoed with silence as my thoughts drifted. I couldn't help but remember how Kerwin used to be when we first met. Back then, maybe it was the novelty, but he was always so gentlemanly. In the early days of our relationship, we'd often go to the library together. He'd patiently explain assignments to me, and when I got distracted staring at him, he'd tap my head with a pen, his ears turning red as he told me to focus. Maybe it was the freshness of it all, or maybe in some fleeting moment, Kerwin truly loved me, but now I no longer cared to figure it out. A lie is still a lie, no matter how beautifully it's wrapped. Its essence will never change. It must have been the relentless overtime these past few days that left me slumped lifelessly in front of my computer. I hadn't even finished the work in hand when my department manager called me into his office for one of his usual lectures. It was nothing more than a stream of harmless criticisms, but as I watched the balding middle-aged man grimace and rant, I couldn't help but recall his sycophantic demeanor in front of Kerwin. The contrast was almost comical. I knew exactly what this was about, currying favor with Kerwin. The manager's fleshy face contorted dramatically as he pointed a finger at me and launched into a tirade of insults. Before I could even process what was happening, a steaming cup of coffee was dumped over my head. The hair I had carefully styled before leaving home that morning was now soaked with thick, scalding coffee. The hot liquid dripped down my hair, onto my cheeks, and soaked into my clothes. I looked utterly pathetic. The door behind me creaked open, and in walked Kerwin, accompanied by the girl from his birthday party. Standing there, drenched in coffee, I felt an overwhelming sense of humiliation. Kerwin glanced at me briefly before shifting his gaze to the manager. The once arrogant manager immediately stood up from his chair, bowing and scraping before Kerwin. Kerwin, ever composed, motioned for the girl behind him to take a seat and then began discussing work-related matters with the manager. I stood there silently, as though I didn't exist. The office seemed to contain only the three of them. The girl, seemingly unaware of who I was, smiled sweetly at me and pulled a pack of tissues from her bag, handing it to me. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually took it. After wrapping up his conversation with the manager, Kerwin turned to me with a warning tone in his voice. If you're not capable of doing the job, just quit. At that moment, I felt suffocated. He knew full well that all of this had been orchestrated by him, that the manager was acting to please him. The sheer injustice of it all brought tears to my eyes, but for the sake of my pride, I blinked them back. After leaving the office, I gradually calmed down. The hot coffee had jolted me awake. I had to resign. The resignation process was swift. By the next day, I had packed up my belongings and left the company. Having quit 2 jobs within half a year, I decided it was time to take a break, give myself a much-needed vacation, and reset. While I was escaping reality, indulging in hot pot and shopping with a friend, Kerwin appeared. His expression was dark as he spotted the person next to me, his face instantly turning icy. Who's he? He demanded. My friend had gone back to the hot pot restaurant to retrieve something she'd left behind, leaving me and her younger brother, who had come along to help carry things, waiting outside. Kerwin's arrogant tone was grating. I didn't bother answering his question and instead retorted, "What does it matter to you who he is? What are you playing at now?" Kerwin's haughty demeanor hadn't changed one bit. "Excuse me, but I don't think she wants to talk to you." Lucien, my friend's younger brother, stepped in, placing himself between us. Tall and composed, he held his ground even against Kerwin's oppressive presence. Kerwin's temple throbbed visibly as he glared at the younger man standing before him. "I'm her boss. You have no right to interfere with our conversation," Kerwin said coldly. "I've already quit. You're not my boss anymore, and there's nothing I want to discuss with you," I said, shattering his delusion. Kerwin's eyes reddened with fury, like a lion driven mad. He snarled, "You're still an employee until I approve your resignation." Lucien let out a mocking laugh, looking at him with derision. "Sir, I take it you're not well versed in labor laws?" His words were sharp and dripping with sarcasm. Before Lucien's voice had fully faded, Kerwin's fist came flying toward him. Lucien barely had time to dodge, and the punch grazed his cheek, leaving a red mark. The impact made it clear that Kerwin had put all his strength into it. Lucien, a 20-year-old brimming with youthful pride, instinctively wanted to fight back. But seeing me behind him, he held himself back, covering his face with his hand. I rushed forward, examining the mark on his face. "Are you okay? Does it hurt?" Lucien, still holding his cheek, looked at me with reddened eyes, like a child who had been wronged. Seeing that he wasn't seriously hurt, I was overcome with guilt. My friend had asked her younger brother, who was studying at a university in Z City, to accompany me, and now he had gotten hurt because of me. I turned to Kerwin with a mix of blame and anger. "I don't think we have anything left to talk about. We broke up a long time ago. From now on, we're just strangers. If you continue to harass me, I'll report you for stalking." Kerwin froze, caught off guard by my words. He glared at Lucien as if contemplating shoving him aside to grab my hand, but Lucien reacted quickly, blocking him before he could act. Realizing he was at a disadvantage, Kerwin softened his tone. "Can't we sit down and talk this through?" he pleaded, his usual arrogance replaced by desperation. But I looked away, my voice cold and distant. "There's nothing to talk about." With that, I grabbed Lucien and walked away, leaving Kerwin standing there, fists clenched tightly as he watched us leave. After the incident, I decided to thank Lucien by treating him to a meal. He accepted gladly, but even then, Kerwin couldn't leave me alone. He appeared again, soaked from the rain, his disheveled hair dripping water down his face. He looked like a man abandoned by the world, his eyes filled with hurt. "Ingrid, I know I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I was just so angry when you left without a word. That's why I acted like that." Even now, he was trying to justify himself. I cut him off, my tone firm. "I'm not interested in your excuses. We're done. I told you before, if you show up again, I'll call the police." "So, are you leaving on your own or should I make you?" Kerwin hesitated, seemingly wanting to say more. "Are you done?" "The meat's ready," Lucien's voice interrupted. He appeared, his hair slightly messy, as if he'd just gotten out of bed, a deliberate move to irritate Kerwin. I chose not to expose him. Kerwin's face darkened further as he glared at Lucien. "Why is he here?" Lucien raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Why wouldn't I be here? Surely you don't think her ex-boyfriend should be here instead?" The way he emphasized ex-boyfriend made Kerwin's expression even uglier. "Ingrid, you told me you loved me," Kerwin said, his voice laced with desperation. For the first time, the situation was beyond his control. His words sounded utterly ridiculous to me. From the very beginning, it was him who lied to me, dismissed me, and deliberately made me suffer. And now, he had the nerve to act like the victim? How convenient. I turned my gaze toward Lucien. Lucien, catching my look, tactfully pretended to have something to do and walked away. Perhaps out of concern, he left me with a parting line. If you run into trouble, just call me. Now, it was just me and Kerwin. Seeing Lucien leave, Kerwin thought he might still stand a chance. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes, but before he could say anything, I cut him off. Kerwin, don't you think you're pathetic? When you questioned me, did you ever reflect on yourself? Did you ever think about your own mistakes? From the moment we met, you've been hiding things, lying to me, and when the truth came out, you brushed it off with a flimsy excuse, not even bothering to explain properly. I want to ask you, what exactly is this love you claim to have for me? Kerwin, cornered by my questions, was about to defend himself, but I didn't give him the chance and continued. Now you're coming back to me, acting as if your love is some grand gesture that'll make me turn back to you. Do you think I'll still orbit around you like I used to, that I can't live without you in my world? How ridiculous. Kerwin, let me make this clear. There's no chance for us anymore. From the moment we reunited and you dismissed your years of lies with a single careless sentence, we were done. Kerwin grabbed my shoulders, his eyes reddened as he stared at me. Listen to me. I love you. I really do. I just. What? I looked at him coldly, watching his helplessness and disarray. You just don't love me. You just saw me as a toy to play with, didn't you? Admit it, Kerwin. You don't love me. You only love yourself. You're coming back to me now because you can't stand the idea of losing me. It was as if I had hit a nerve, like a cat whose tail was stepped on. Kerwin panicked. He tried to prove his so-called love for me, spewing a bunch of meaningless words in a desperate attempt to justify himself. I didn't want to waste more time on him and told him to leave. Before he could say anything else, I shut the door in his face and walked back into the room. Jenny, my roommate from high school and college, had been there to witness my relationship with Kerwin from our university days through our early careers. When she saw me return, her eyes lit up. So, how did it go? I was confused and sat down in my chair. What do you mean, how did it go? Jenny pressed on, you and Kerwin. Oh, we broke up. What else could it be? Having finally seen Kerwin's true colors, I didn't feel the heavy sadness I used to when we broke up. It was more like a burden lifted, a sigh of relief. Jenny's excitement grew. You really broke up? You're not going to soften up and take him back, are you? Her skeptical look didn't surprise me. After all, when I was with Kerwin, my life revolved around him. If I wasn't with him, I was working part-time jobs. Every time we broke up, I'd be the one crawling back, begging for reconciliation. Jenny used to tease me, calling me hopelessly love-struck. This time, I spoke seriously, assuring Jenny that it was truly over with Kerwin. No more entanglements. Jenny was shocked at first, then, as if struck by a wild idea, she stared at me with a wolfish grin. He, she chuckled, looking downright mischievous. Her gaze made me uneasy. I poked at the meat on my plate. What scheme are you cooking up now? Jenny looked a bit sheepish, her tone suddenly hesitant. What do you think of my brother? I glanced at Lucien, who was sitting nearby, quietly putting meatballs into the hot pot and thoughtfully sharing the cooked meat between our bowls. He looked every bit like a caring domestic type, handsome, driven, considerate, a great young man. He's perfect, I replied sincerely. Jenny's expression turned cautious as she probed further. So what if? Realizing where this was going, I quickly interrupted her. Lucien had stepped into the kitchen, and I seized the moment to breathe a sigh of relief. Stop talking nonsense. Jenny grinned playfully. I'm just trying to help you heal, you know. Lucien's perfect, good-looking, kind, never been in a relationship, rich, and caring enough. I cut her off firmly. We're not a match. Besides, he's too young. I'm not interested in your brother. Seeing how resolute I was, Jenny gave up. All right. Such a pity though. That kid's had a crush on you for years. Her words caught me off guard, and I nearly choked on my water. Him? A crush on me? Of course. Why do you think he used to pick me up from school all the time back in high school? It was just an excuse to see you. I glanced at Lucien, who had just returned from the kitchen, and motioned for Jenny to stop talking. With that, the topic was dropped. After the hot pot, Jenny and her brother helped me clean up. Then, Jenny and I launched into full-on bestie chat mode, while Lucien quietly sat in a corner, playing on his phone. By evening, Jenny decided to stay the night since it had been ages since we'd had a proper catch-up. Lucien, however, opted to head back to his dorm. When Jenny went to shower, I walked Lucien to the door to see him off. As I was about to say goodbye and lock the door, Lucien reached out his long arm, shutting the door with a thud. He leaned against the door, trapping me between him and it, looking down at me with his clear, intense eyes. The boy who was usually sunny and approachable now exuded an almost predatory air. "I'm not a kid anymore. I'm an adult now." His ears were red as he spoke, his gaze unwavering and filled with determination. Jenny's words about Lucien's longtime crush on me echoed in my head. Faced with his earnestness, I was at a loss for words. I admit, for a moment, I was spellbound. Before I could respond, Lucien straightened up, as if afraid to hear a rejection. "See you tomorrow," he said hastily before turning and leaving in a flustered rush. After that near confession, Lucien seemed to find every opportunity to strike up a conversation or orchestrate accidental encounters. I lost count of how many times this month I'd seen him following me. Today, I rubbed my temples as I looked at his puppy dog face. "Don't you have classes to attend? Why are you following me around every day?" Lucien widened his clear eyes innocently. "Didn't you know? It's break time." I smacked my forehead, realizing I'd been working so long I'd completely forgotten students even had holidays. As someone who had watched Lucien grow up, I couldn't bring myself to outright reject him. Instead, I gently suggested he spend his break doing something meaningful to enrich his life. The subtext was clear: stop following me. Perhaps it was the wounds from my last relationship, but I wasn't ready to jump into something new. Emotional recovery doesn't happen overnight. Besides, Lucien was my best friend's younger brother, a boy I'd seen grow up. Hurting him wasn't something I wanted to do. But Lucien acted like he didn't understand my hints, playing dumb. When I mentioned it to Jenny, hoping she might talk some sense into her brother, she surprised me by brushing it off entirely. Instead, she started gossiping about me and Lucien, clearly enjoying the drama. At the start of the school semester, just when I thought Lucien would finally settle down after returning to campus, he went ahead and rented an apartment directly across from mine. When I opened the door and saw Lucien standing opposite me, he greeted me with a grin. "What a coincidence," he said. Was it really just a coincidence? In truth, Lucien was like an overly clingy presence that I simply couldn't shake off. There were times when I'd had enough and firmly expressed my rejection to him, but Lucien was like an indestructible cockroach. Just when I was at my wit's end, he'd take a thoughtful step back. Then, slowly but surely, he'd inch closer again. This cycle repeated endlessly, leaving me both exasperated and helpless. The only upside to Lucien moving in across from me was gaining access to a top-notch chef whose meals I could conveniently borrow, given my subpar cooking skills. Barely edible at best, and the fact that Kerwin was no better in the kitchen meant we often just made do with each other's lackluster attempts at meals. But Lucien's cooking. I strongly suspected he had trained at some professional culinary school. Every time I bowed not to impose on his cooking anymore, the delicious aroma wafting from his apartment next door would weaken my resolve, and I'd find myself wandering over again. In this peculiar neighborly relationship built on shared meals, Lucien and I grew closer as time went on. The wounds from my relationship with Kerwin slowly healed, leaving only faint scars. I found myself thinking about the past less and less. I sent out resumes, secured a new job, and started focusing on building my own life again. Once I started working, Lucien would wait for me to get off work every day. Over time, this evolved into him picking me up after work. At first, I told him not to bother, but he insisted, and so our relationship settled into this strange in-between stage, more than friendship but not quite lovers. Lucien never pushed for more. Apart from being incredibly good to me, he held back, afraid of putting too much pressure on me. Everything changed one evening. On my way home from work, I ran into a drunken thug who started harassing me. Before I could react, Lucien appeared and, seeing what was happening, punched the guy several times without hesitation. It wasn't until the police came to mediate that the situation finally ended. Lucien walked away from the fight with a gash on his face from the scuffle. As I treated his wound, he sat there quietly, staring at me intently. When I moved my hand away, Lucien grabbed it. His voice was steady yet gentle as he confessed his feelings to me. He said he was terrified of what might happen if he failed to protect me. I couldn't deny it, I was moved. So I said yes. Lucien wrapped me in his arms, grinning like a giddy fool, as if he were the spoiled son of a wealthy family who had just gotten his way. I saw Kerwin again at a class reunion. The one dashing man who had always cared about appearances now seemed utterly defeated. He sat alone on the couch, drinking excessively, a shadow of his former self. A few old classmates mentioned that his family's company was on a steep decline, and Kerwin had lost all motivation. His family had already begun grooming a new heir. After the reunion ended, I waited at the door for Lucien to pick me up. Kerwin, reeking of alcohol, approached me. Just as he opened his mouth to say something, Lucien's car pulled up. Kerwin froze, his expression filled with sadness as he asked, "Are you with him now?" I got into the passenger seat of Lucien's car and glanced at Kerwin, who was standing by the road. Speaking in the tone of someone addressing an old friend, I said, "The past is in the past. What's meant to be let go should be let go. I wish you happiness moving forward." Lucien leaned over to buckle my seatbelt before starting the car. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Kerwin cover his face, crouching down like a helpless child, sobbing in regret. But unfortunately, there's no medicine for regret in this world.